The frail slave no one wanted, until he smelled smoke before anyone woke. The cotton fields of Blackwood Plantation stretched endlessly under the oppressive Mississippi sun in 1857. Among the dozens of enslaved people working the land, there was one who stood apart by his apparent uselessness. His name was Samuel, though most simply called him the Frail One. Samuel was 23, but looked far older, his body thin and bent from childhood illness that left him with a persistent cough and trembling hands. While other men picked 300 pounds of cotton daily, Samuel struggled to gather 70. The overseer, Garrett, had tried to sell Samuel twice, but no plantation wanted a slave who couldn't earn his keep. Master Blackwood kept him only because Samuel's mother, Esther, was the best seamstress in 3 counties. The night air hung thick as Samuel lay on the rough wooden floor of the slave quarters. 20 people slept here, bodies packed close on thin bedding. The August heat made sleep impossible, and Samuel's cough kept him awake more nights than not. He stared at the darkness, listening to the breathing around him, the occasional cry of a child, the distant howl of a dog. But there was something else in the darkness of Blackwood Plantation. People were disappearing. First, it was Big Marcus, a field hand strong as an ox. He was there when everyone slept. By morning his bedding was empty. Master Blackwood sent slave catchers with dogs into the swamps. They found nothing. 2 weeks later, young Thomas vanished, then Sarah, then old Jacob. 5 people in 3 months, all vanishing without a trace. The slave catchers found nothing. The dogs found nothing. Fear spread through the quarters like wildfire. People stopped sleeping soundly, kept their children close, watched shadows with wide eyes. They whispered theories. Some said slave catchers from other plantations were stealing people. Others believed it was something worse. Samuel's mother clutched her Bible and prayed every night. Master Blackwood increased patrols, added overseers, implemented head counts 3 times daily. Punishments grew harsher, but the disappearances continued, defying every precaution. The terror was in the randomness, the way it could strike anyone, any time. Samuel felt the fear as deeply as anyone, perhaps more so. His weakness made him vulnerable in ways others weren't. He couldn't fight, couldn't run fast, couldn't defend himself against whatever dark force was taking people in the night. He lay awake most nights, his heart pounding at every sound, every shift of shadow, every unexplained creak of wood. His mother tried to comfort him, but her own fear was palpable, her hands shaking as she stroked his hair like he was still a child. It was on one of these sleepless nights that Samuel noticed something strange. He had listened to the breathing patterns for so many years that he knew them intimately. That night, he realized that before each disappearance, there had been a change in the pattern, an unnatural silence, as if someone was holding their breath. He had noticed it before Marcus vanished, before Thomas, before Sarah, before Jacob. Samuel's hands trembled more violently than usual as this realization settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He wanted to tell someone, to warn them, but who would believe him? He was the frail one, the useless one, the boy who coughed and shook and couldn't even pick cotton properly. His words carried no weight. His observations would be dismissed as the frightened imaginings of a weak mind. Even his mother, who loved him fiercely, treated him like fragile glass that might shatter at any moment. He was invisible in a world that only valued strength, silent in a place where only powerful voices mattered. As the days passed, Samuel became obsessed with listening, with waiting for that telltale silence. He fought sleep with every fiber of his being, biting his lip until it bled, digging his nails into his palms, forcing his eyes to stay open even when exhaustion made his body scream for rest. His mother noticed his deterioration, the dark circles under his eyes growing deeper, his already thin frame becoming skeletal, his cough worsening until blood flecked his lips. She begged him to rest, to let go. But he couldn't tell her why he was so terrified to close his eyes. How could he explain that he was listening for death itself? The answer came on a humid night in late August, when the air was so thick it felt like drowning. Samuel lay in his usual spot near the door, his mother sleeping fitly beside him when he heard it again. The silence, not a natural quiet, but an absence of sound so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly, carefully opened his eyes just enough to see through his lashes. In the darkness, barely visible by the thin moonlight filtering through the cracks, he saw a figure moving between the sleeping bodies. It wasn't a spirit or a demon, it was a man, moving with practiced silence, a cloth in his hands. Samuel watched, paralyzed with terror, as the figure knelt beside Isaiah, a young father of two who slept near the back wall. The cloth went over Isaiah's mouth and nose, and Samuel could see the brief struggle, the silent thrashing that lasted only seconds before Isaiah went limp. The figure dragged the unconscious body toward the door, moving with horrifying efficiency, and Samuel had only a split second to make a choice. He closed his eyes and went limp, forcing his breathing to remain steady even as his heart threatened to explode. The figure passed within inches of him, close enough that Samuel could smell tobacco and whiskey, could hear the heavy breathing of someone engaged in hard labor. The door creaked open, and Samuel felt the brief brush of night air before it closed again. He waited, counting his heartbeats. 100, 200, 300, before he dared to open his eyes again. Isaiah was gone. The space where he had slept was empty, the bedding still warm. Samuel's mind raced with possibilities, with the terrible knowledge he now possessed. The disappearances weren't supernatural, weren't random acts of spirits or divine judgment. They were deliberate, calculated, performed by someone who had access to the quarters, who knew the plantation, who could move without raising alarm. But who? And more terrifying, why? The next morning, when Isaiah's absence was discovered, Samuel said nothing. He couldn't, because his silence was all that kept him alive. The figure had passed right by him, had chosen Isaiah over him, had left him breathing in the darkness. If he spoke now, if he revealed what he had seen, he would become the next target. The realization filled him with crushing guilt and paralyzing fear. He was a coward, he told himself, useless in every way that mattered, too weak to save anyone, too frightened to even try. But the knowledge ate at him like acid. Isaiah had children who cried for their father, a wife who collapsed in grief, parents who aged a decade overnight. Samuel saw their pain and felt it as his own, knew that his silence made him complicit in their suffering. He wanted to scream the truth, to point at the monsters hiding in plain sight, but fear kept his jaw locked shut. At night, he no longer even tried to sleep, just lay in the darkness with eyes wide open, waiting for the silence that preceded death, wondering if tonight would be the night the figure returned for him. The plantation existed in a state of escalating terror. Master Blackwood hired more overseers, installed locks on the quarters that were fastened from the outside, implemented a system of chains that bound people together at night so no one could move without disturbing others. But somehow, despite every precaution, the disappearances continued. 2 more people vanished in September, 1 in early October. The quarters became a prison within a prison. The enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation, trapped not just by their bondage, but by the unknown predator hunting them in the darkness. Samuel's health deteriorated to the point where even the brutal Garrett stopped expecting him to work the fields. He was assigned to the stables instead, mucking out stalls and hauling water, tasks that didn't require speed or strength. It was in the stables, during a cold October afternoon, that Samuel overheard a conversation that changed everything. 2 men were talking in the tack room, their voices carrying through the thin walls. One voice Samuel recognized as Garrett, the overseer. The other was unfamiliar, rough and cruel. "How much for the next batch?" the stranger asked. "Depends on the quality," Garrett replied. Strong ones fetch more. Last 3 I sent you brought good money, I hear. Good money indeed. New Orleans market's hungry for workers. No questions asked, no papers needed. You grab 'em, I transport 'em, we split the profit. Master Blackwood don't pay you enough to turn down this kind of opportunity. Samuel's blood turned to ice. It wasn't supernatural forces taking people in the night. It was Garrett, the very man supposed to watch over them, selling them to illegal traders who would transport them far downriver, where they would be worked to death in the sugar fields of Louisiana, never to be seen or heard from again. The disappearances were kidnappings, pure and simple, a betrayal by someone they were forced to obey, a predator hiding behind the mask of authority. The realization filled Samuel with a rage he had never known before. All his life, he had accepted his weakness, his uselessness, his place at the bottom of an already degraded existence. But this was too much. These were his people, his family, his mother who might be next. Someone had to do something, and if Samuel was the only one who knew the truth, then it had to be him. No matter how frail, no matter how frightened, no matter the cost. But what could he do? He had no proof, no evidence beyond what he had overheard. If he went to Master Blackwood, Garrett would deny everything, would likely arrange for Samuel to be the next to disappear. If he tried to warn the others, Garrett would hear of it within hours. The overseer had informants everywhere. Samuel was trapped by his knowledge, burdened with a truth he could not speak, watching the people around him live in ignorance of the monster among them. The answer came in the form of fire. Samuel had always been sensitive to smells, his other senses perhaps heightened by his physical weakness. He could detect the subtle change in air pressure before rain, could smell rot in timber before anyone else noticed, could sense smoke on the wind before flames were visible. It was this sensitivity that woke him in the dead of night in late October, when the first frost had touched the ground and the air was crisp and cold. He smelled smoke, not the normal smoke of cooking fires or fireplaces, but the acrid, intense smell of a structure fire, of something burning that shouldn't be burning. Samuel's eyes snapped open, his heart immediately racing, and he saw a faint orange glow through the cracks in the quarter's walls. The big house was burning. Flames licked at its eastern wing, fed by dry wood and autumn winds, spreading with terrifying speed. And everyone in the quarters, locked from the outside by Garrett's paranoid security measures, was still asleep. Samuel had seconds to make a decision. He could stay silent, could let the fire spread while he waited for someone else to notice, could preserve his own safety by doing nothing, or he could scream, could wake everyone, could pound on the locked door until someone came with the key. The second option would draw attention to himself, would put him in Garrett's sightline, would make him visible in a way that could be fatal. But in that moment, smelling smoke and seeing the growing glow of flames, Samuel realized that he was already dead. They were all already dead, had been dying slowly for years, for generations, for centuries. What was one more death if it meant others might live? He screamed, a sound that came from the deepest part of his soul, a primal wail that cut through the night like a knife. Fire! Fire! The big house is burning! Wake up! Fire! His weak voice cracked and broke, but he screamed again and again, pounding on the locked door with fists that had never known strength, throwing his frail body against the wood with a violence that seemed impossible from someone so weak. The quarters erupted into chaos. People woke in confusion and panic, children crying, voices shouting, bodies pressed against the locked door as the smell of smoke grew stronger and the orange glow brighter. Samuel kept screaming, kept pounding, even as his throat burned raw and his hands bled from splinters. Through the walls they could hear the sounds of the fire spreading, timbers cracking, glass shattering, and still the door remained locked. Finally, they heard running footsteps outside. A key rattled in the lock, and the door burst open. But it wasn't Garrett who stood there. It was Master Blackwood himself. Wild-eyed and in his nightclothes, his face covered in soot. "Everyone out! Form a bucket line! Move! The house! Save the house!" Behind him, the plantation had transformed into an inferno. The big house was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky, and sparks were beginning to drift toward the other buildings. The enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation poured out of the quarters and did what was expected of them, what they had been conditioned to do their entire lives. They formed bucket lines, passed water from the well, fought the fire that was destroying their master's property, risking their lives to save the wealth built on their backs. Samuel stood among them, his weak arms barely able to lift the buckets, his lungs burning from smoke and exertion. But he kept moving, kept passing buckets, kept fighting alongside everyone else. It was in the chaos and confusion of the fire that Samuel saw Garrett slip away from the bucket line and move toward the quarters. Samuel's blood ran cold as he understood the overseer's intention. With everyone distracted by the fire, with locks left unlocked and attention elsewhere, Garrett was going to take another victim, was going to use the chaos as cover for his crimes. And Samuel was the only one who noticed, the only one who saw the predator moving in the shadows while everyone else fought the flames. Samuel made a choice. He left the bucket line, following Garrett through the smoke-filled darkness, his heart pounding with terror and determination. He didn't have a plan, didn't have strength or weapons, had nothing but the truth burning in his chest as hot as the fire consuming the big house. He followed Garrett into the quarters, where the overseer was already moving toward the back, where the children slept separately from their parents, where small bodies would be easy to overpower and transport. "I know what you've been doing," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow cutting through the distant chaos of the fire. Garrett spun around, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt, his eyes narrowing as he saw the frail slave who should have been invisible, should have been irrelevant. "You don't know nothing," Garrett snarled, "and you best keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." "I know you've been selling people downriver," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger even as his body trembled. "I heard you talking in the stables. I saw you take Isaiah. I know everything." Garrett's face twisted with rage and something else, something like fear. He took a step toward Samuel, his hand closing around the knife handle. "You weak, useless piece of nothing. You think anyone's going to believe you? You think anyone cares what you have to say? I could kill you right here and no one would even notice you were gone." "Maybe," Samuel said, and he was amazed to find that he was no longer afraid, standing in that moment. Facing down the monster who had haunted the plantation for months, Samuel felt something shift inside him. Maybe no one would care if I died, but they would care about the truth. They would care that you've been stealing Master Blackwood's property, selling his slaves for your own profit. That's theft, Garrett. That's a hanging offense, even for a white man. The knife was out now, gleaming in the faint light, and Garrett moved toward Samuel with murder in his eyes. But Samuel had already made peace with death, had already accepted that his weak body was not built for this world, that his life had been borrowed time from the moment of his birth. What he could do, what he had to do, was make sure the truth didn't die with him. "I wrote it all down," Samuel lied, the words coming with surprising ease. "Every name, every date, every conversation I overheard, I hid the papers where you'll never find them, but others will. If I die tonight, if I disappear like the others, those papers will find their way to Master Blackwood. And he'll know what you've been doing, how you've been robbing him, how you've been destroying his property. It was a desperate bluff, a gamble with no odds of success. Samuel couldn't read or write, had never held a pen in his life, had no papers and no hiding place. But Garrett didn't know that. And in the overseer's eyes, Samuel saw doubt, saw fear, saw the same terror that had gripped the quarters for 3 long months. "You're lying," Garrett said, but his voice wavered. "You can't even write." "My mother can," Samuel replied, another lie, but spoken with such conviction that it sounded like truth. She's been teaching me in secret. Every name is written down. Every crime is documented. Kill me, and you seal your own fate." For a long moment, they stood in the dim quarters, the smoke from the fire outside drifting through the cracks, the sounds of shouting and chaos providing a surreal backdrop to their confrontation. Garrett's knife hand shook, his face contorted with indecision, with rage, with the terrible knowledge that his secret was no longer safe. The power dynamic had shifted in a way that should have been impossible. A frail slave standing up to an armed overseer, David facing Goliath with nothing but words and will. The moment shattered when Master Blackwood's voice rang out from outside, calling for Garrett, demanding his presence. The overseer's eyes never left Samuel's face as he slowly backed toward the door, the knife still in his hand, murder and threat written in every line of his body. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You watch your back, boy. You watch it every second of every day, because I'm coming for you." "I'll be watching," Samuel replied, and meant it. "I'll always be watching, and so will others, now that they know." Garrett disappeared into the smoke-filled night, and Samuel collapsed against the wall, his legs finally giving out, his entire body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. He had bought himself time, nothing more. Garrett would eventually realize the bluff, would come for him in the darkness, would silence the only witness to his crimes. But Samuel had also planted a seed, had created doubt, had made the overseer vulnerable in a way that might matter. The fire burned for 3 more hours before it was finally contained. The big house was a total loss, its western wing completely destroyed, its eastern wing damaged beyond repair. But the other buildings survived, including the quarters, and most importantly, not a single person died. Master Blackwood stood in the ashes of his home as dawn broke, his face grey with exhaustion and loss, his fortune literally gone up in smoke. The enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves, alive but uncertain what would come next. It was Esther, Samuel's mother, who approached Master Blackwood as he stood surveying the ruins. She spoke quietly, respectfully, with the careful words of someone who knew the price of boldness. "Master, there's something you need to know. My son Samuel, he heard things about the disappearances, about Garrett." Her voice trembled but held firm. "He heard Garrett talking about selling people, about money from New Orleans traders. He's been watching, Master. He knows the truth." Master Blackwood's head snapped around, his eyes finding Samuel in the crowd. The look on his face was unreadable, a mixture of anger and interest and calculation. "Bring him here," he commanded, and Samuel was pushed forward by gentle hands, his mother walking beside him, her fingers tight around his arm. "Tell me," Master Blackwood said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me everything you know." So Samuel did, standing in the ruins of the plantation's big house, his voice hoarse from smoke and screaming, his body trembling with exhaustion. Samuel told the truth. He described the conversations he had overheard, the disappearances he had witnessed, the pattern of silence before each vanishing. He explained how Garrett had been selling people to illegal traders, pocketing the profit while reporting the disappearances as runaways. He spoke of Isaiah, of Marcus, of Thomas and Sarah and Jacob, and all the others whose names deserved to be remembered. Master Blackwood listened in silence, his face growing darker with each revelation. When Samuel finished, the master turned to where Garrett stood at the edge of the crowd, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding and condemnation that needed no words. Garrett ran. He bolted into the tree line, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush, but he didn't get far. Master Blackwood sent riders after him, men on horses with rifles and rope, and by noon they had dragged him back beaten and bloody to face justice. The punishment was swift and public. Master Blackwood, who valued his property above all else, who saw the enslaved people of his plantation as investments to be protected, could not tolerate theft of this magnitude. Garrett was hanged from the great oak tree at the edge of the cotton fields, his body left swinging in the autumn wind as a message to anyone else who might think to steal from the master. The enslaved people watched the execution in silence, their feelings too complex to express. Relief that the monster was gone, yes, but also the bitter knowledge that justice had been served, not for the human lives lost, but for the property value stolen. Samuel became something he had never been before, visible. Master Blackwood, in his strange and twisted logic, saw value in the frail slave who had protected his investments, who had uncovered the thefts, who had raised the alarm during the fire. He elevated Samuel to a position in the household, made him a runner who carried messages between the plantation and town, gave him slightly better food and clothes, acknowledged his existence in ways that felt both like reward and further imprisonment. But the cost of visibility was high. Samuel now carried the weight of his own betrayal. He had stopped Garrett, yes, but he hadn't freed anyone. The people who had disappeared were still gone, sold into even worse suffering in the sugar fields of Louisiana, and Samuel's testimony had done nothing to bring them home. He had saved some lives by raising the alarm about the fire, but he had also ensured the plantation would continue, that the system of bondage would persist, that others would be born and die in chains because he had helped protect Master Blackwood's property. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to save his people, he had strengthened their chains. In seeking justice, he had reinforced the very system that made such injustice possible. His mother tried to comfort him, told him he had done the right thing, that he had saved lives and exposed evil. But Samuel lay awake at night in his new quarters, closer to the big house now, hearing the sounds of reconstruction beginning, and wondered if there was any such thing as a right choice in a world built entirely on wrong. Winter came to Blackwood Plantation, cold and harsh, and the enslaved people worked to rebuild what the fire had destroyed. Samuel carried messages, ran errands, existed in a strange liminal space between the quarters and the big house, belonging to neither world, trusted by none. The other slaves resented his elevation, saw him as Master Blackwood's pet, as someone who had betrayed one of their own, even if that person was a monster. The white household staff viewed him with suspicion, as something that had been elevated beyond its proper place, a disruption in the natural order. But Samuel endured as he had always endured, because endurance was all he knew. He watched and waited and listened, as he had always done, because watching and listening were his only tools. And in the cold darkness of December nights, when the wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and the world seemed frozen and dead, Samuel made himself a promise. He would bear witness, he would remember the names of those who had vanished, would carry their stories, would refuse to let them disappear completely from memory and history. Samuel knew he would likely die in bondage, would never taste the freedom that existed somewhere beyond the plantation's borders, somewhere in the mythical north he had heard whispered about but never seen. But he also knew that bearing witness mattered, that the act of remembering was itself a form of resistance, that truth had power even when it couldn't set you free. He had been the frail slave no one wanted, the weak and useless boy who seemed destined to disappear into the machinery of slavery without leaving a mark. Instead, he had become a witness to atrocity, a voice for the voiceless, a keeper of memory in a place designed to erase memory. Years later, when the plantation system finally crumbled under the weight of civil war, when the enslaved people of the South walked away from their bondage toward an uncertain freedom, Samuel would still be there. He would outlive Master Blackwood, would outlive the plantation itself, would survive to tell his story to anyone who would listen. He would speak the names of those who vanished, would describe the terror of those months when death stalked the quarters in the form of a trusted authority figure, would bear witness to both the evil men do and the small, desperate acts of courage that resist that evil. But that was years in the future. On that cold December night, Samuel was just a young man, lying awake in the darkness, his body weak but his spirit somehow unbroken, his place in the world uncertain, but his purpose clear. He would remember. He would bear witness. He would refuse to let the disappeared be forgotten. It was the only freedom he could claim, the only power he possessed, and he would wield it with everything he had until his last breath. The plantation slept around him, rebuilt but forever changed, scarred by fire and betrayal and the weight of accumulated sins. And Samuel, the frail slave no one had wanted, lay awake in the darkness and remembered and remembered and remembered. Because in a world that wanted to forget, remembering was an act of rebellion. Because in a system built on erasing humanity, bearing witness was an assertion of existence. Because he had smelled the smoke before anyone else woke, and he had chosen to scream rather than stay silent, and that choice had changed everything and nothing all at once. The story of Blackwood Plantation would be forgotten by history, just another unremarkable farm among thousands in the antebellum South. The names of those who disappeared would never appear in any official record, their lives and deaths reduced to ledger entries, if they were mentioned at all. Master Blackwood would be buried in the family cemetery with a nice headstone, his crimes and complicity washed clean by time and selective memory. Even Garrett's execution would become just a footnote, a story about a corrupt overseer, stripped of context and consequence. But Samuel's testimony would survive, passed down through generations of his family, preserved in letters and oral histories, and eventually, decades after his death, in the archives of abolitionists who collected stories of slavery's horrors. His voice, weak and trembling but stubbornly persistent, would echo across time, a reminder that even the most powerless person can bear witness, can refuse to forget, can insist on truth, even when truth has no immediate power to change anything. That was Samuel's freedom, hard-won and impossibly limited, but real nonetheless. Not the freedom to go where he wished, or be who he wanted, or live without fear, but the freedom to remember, to speak, to refuse to pretend that evil was anything other than what it was. It was a small freedom, a painful freedom, a freedom that came at enormous cost. But it was his, claimed in the darkness by a frail boy who had finally found the strength to scream.